We begin with a short presentation on Breakthrough's norm change framework. For that, I invite Animesh Sharma, Director, Evaluations at Breakthrough. Animesh.
Thank you, Samra. Good morning and welcome to all the guests here. It's a pleasure to present Breakthrough's norm change framework. I just wanted to also contextualize the way we are looking at this particular piece, and I'm really glad that Priyanka, you talked about Breakthrough's norms change work, the way we are looking at it. And I think when we talk about norms change work, it is very essential to look at how and why norms change work is important. If I had to look at somewhere in 2015, 2018, that period, a lot of work, a lot of conversation narratives were specifically around behavior change and behavior change communication. I think that still is going pretty strong. At the same time, what has really added in that narrative is the norms piece. What we have started talking about, what we have started researching about is how behavior change and norms change are interrelated. Why are the two important? And when we specifically look at behavior change as our intended outcomes, why is it important for us to also take into consideration what is the current situation with respect to the norms? What all specific norms are influencing our behaviors of interest? How strong are those norms? In what manner are they influencing our behaviors? And then design our interventions keeping the two into consideration. So with that, I'll start with the presentation. It's a brief presentation. I'll also offer a caveat that this is essentially about Breakthrough's framework that we are using in terms of designing how we look at gender norms. It is about looking at how we measure gender norms and how we take these into consideration while designing our interventions. At the same time, I also want to underscore that this is in no way like a perfect framework. This is something that we are trying to develop, and we're doing it in an iterative manner. I'll also be fairly candid in terms of the kind of learnings that we've had during the course of developing and implementing this framework, and specifically aspects where we feel that we're able to reflect and we're able to figure out what all things we can do differently next time. So with that hope, I'll start the presentation. The first thing, as I mentioned, is very important to understand what is it that we're trying to change. A lot of grants, a lot of interventions that we design are specifically designed for behavior change. And a lot of donor interest is around behavior change because that is something which is tangible, that is something which is observable, and also relatively easily measurable. And then why do we look at norms change in that case? There's been a lot of research around it in the past decade or so, which has talked about the importance of norms. And that's precisely the reason why a lot of behavior change programs now are rooted in gender norms. We specifically look at what are the prevailing gender norms in the community, how are they influencing the behaviors, what are the interlinkages between the behavior change models and the norms change models that we look at, and how the prevailing norms actually influencing our behaviors. And then when we design our behavior change strategy, we keep into consideration what the norms are and to what extent we can actually shift them or change them for us to see some kind of sustainable behavior change. Now, I want to draw some attention on the two-way relationship that is there between norms and behavior change. I feel like norms, in a certain sense, can be seen as drivers of behavior. So when you're actually looking at some kind of behavior change, I would say it's relatively easier for us to just do behavior change in isolation. But when you actually look at designing programs which are rooted in gender norms, and when you consciously look at changing the norms first or parallelly for us to change behaviors later on, what essentially does is that your altered behaviors are much more sticky, they're much more likely to last and hence more sustainable. So that's one kind of relationship that we usually see in our fields. The other is wherein we look at behaviors as drivers of norms, wherein we look at small behaviors, micro behaviors that you start changing in the community, And once those behaviors start being more observable, when the people in the community start noticing those changes, that is when there's a certain kind of reinforcement that happens, which ultimately results in norms change. So broadly, the point is to highlight how the two things are interrelated, not necessarily one leading to another. So any kind of intervention that we look at wherein we have norms change and behavior change, the first thing essentially is to look at the linkages between the two, how are the two linked and how is one leading to another, and particularly breaking down the norms in terms of what are the empirical expectations, what people see around them and their expectations in terms of how they see others behaving, the normative expectations in terms of what they assume or perceive that the others expect them to do. And lastly, the conditional cooperation in terms of when they behave in a certain way, there's always a conditionality around it, that if we get the support from the community, that is when we'll behave in a certain manner. One important piece that we have particularly started realizing and we've started investing is the importance of reference groups. When we design any behavior change intervention and norms change intervention, it is very important that when you draw linkages between behavior change and norms change, it is essential to also identify and clearly document who the reference groups are. Who are those small or large groups or subgroups of individuals who are actually putting or exerting some kind of pressure on the individuals or different communities to behave in a certain way. So when we talk about expectations being at the center of gender norms, whose expectations are those? And I think that is something which I feel is at the core of any norms change intervention. We'll delve a little deeper into it, that what kind of meaning do we draw from reference groups and how our understanding around reference groups has also evolved over the years. Broadly, if you were to look at the process of identifying reference groups, one thing that we have learned over the years is that whenever we talk about, let's say, a socio-ecological model, wherein in Breakthrough's case, the adolescents or the youth are at the center, and then you have different layers of individuals or groups, for instance, the siblings, the family, parents, or the larger community, kind of exerting certain kind of pressures. And it is very logical for us to assume that they become the reference groups for a lot of the behaviors or the norms that we talk about. For us to be extremely sure in terms of who exactly is the reference group for which norm, we feel that it's important for us to dive a little deeper and not keep it so much at the surface level or keep it so much intuitive. And that is why it is important to also ask certain questions. So there are certain questions that we've been particularly looking at in terms of defining our reference groups, that if, let's say, you're talking about a particular behavior, whom do you trust to discuss your life decisions? So just imagine an adolescent or a youth answering this question. So look at whom is that adolescent or the youth is actually trusting with respect to their life decisions. For in this case, in this context, it could be about education, it could be about marriage. Who are they likely to seek advice from when they look at their life decisions? Who are they likely to fear when they talk about life decisions? And also, who are the people that they really look up to when they make some of these decisions? And when you kind of bring these questions together, what we see is that there's a clear pattern in terms of how we define the reference groups. There'd be certain people in the community, in the family, who we would see as who a source of information for us. So if I want some information around my career, around marriage, I would reach out to that individual and get as much information as I can around that topic, purely because of the kind of network that they have, the kind of information that they have. Not necessarily they might have that kind of power of influencing you. The second category would be the people who are actually decision makers. So for instance, in the context of our work, it could be the parents, particularly the fathers. So they're the ones who are actually making decisions for you. At the same time, they might be influencing your decisions, but at the same time, you do not have that kind of power to reach out to them for every decision or discuss that in detail. And then there's a third category of reference group wherein you are seeking their acceptance. And particularly when we talk about youth, adults, I feel that that's the role that the peers play. that at that age when your personality is also kind of going through certain kind of metamorphosis, you essentially look up to your peers, your group members, and you seek their acceptance. So there's a certain kind of aspiration that you'd want to be accepted in those groups, and hence you would want to conform to what the behaviors are. And also there's a certain kind of fear that you wouldn't want to be excluded from that group. So I think what essentially is at the crux is that when we look at reference groups, there's no one composite group of reference groups. There are multiple subgroups. And what essentially is important, and I think a lot of that can come if there is a proper formative research before planning any intervention is done, to identify who these different reference groups are, and also identifying what kind of influence do they have on the core target group. So in this case, if it's the adolescents, it's important to map those different reference groups and the kind of influences that they exert, and also to identify the kind of conversations that the adolescents or the youth are having with these reference groups, because a lot of times these expectations are set, but those would happen without any clear-cut communication between the two groups. So in case there's no clear communication between the two groups, a lot of pressures that we talk about, a lot of expectations that we talk about would essentially be more their perceptions rather than anything else. I'll just quickly talk about the broad framework that we've been using at Breakthrough in terms of looking at norms, not just in terms of measuring the strength or the prevalence of the norms, but also unpacking the norms in terms of what kind of implications could these have when we look at designing any kind of intervention or a program around norms and behavior change. So broadly, these are the 5 dimensions that we look at. What are the personal beliefs? So if we are essentially keeping adolescents or youth at the center of the intervention, it is very essential to talk about what their personal beliefs are, which essentially means is what is their willingness to shift a particular norm? How much are they open to change certain things around them? Second is empirical expectations, like I mentioned before, that this is essentially about what you see around yourself, what you see other people around you doing it. In a certain sense, it talks about the strength and prevalence of the norm. Normative expectations, it is essentially about the perceptions I have in terms of what people are expecting me to do, which essentially talks about the kind of pressures that I see or the pressures that I place on myself to adhere to a certain kind of expectation. And lastly, it is also important to unpack what kind of sanctions do you think are there if there is some kind of breaking of a norm. Who is actually enforcing those sanctions? Because we talked about different categories of reference groups. So among those, who are the ones who are more likely to enforce any kind of consequences? And what is the severity of those sanctions? That essentially helps us understand what kind of backlash can you expect from an intervention like this, and which specific reference groups do you want to target in the intervention. And lastly, if in case there are any exceptions to breaking the norm, etc. And lastly, before we close this, we also wanted to talk about how we're looking at the way we look at norms change. It seems more like a spectrum rather than anything else. We feel that whenever there's any kind of movement or relaxation in certain norms, it kind of goes through a certain kind of a journey. So on the left-hand side, you see there's a case of proper relaxation of a certain norm. So any norm which was fairly stringent at the beginning, but now what we see is that different groups are fairly comfortable with respect to the change. They're accepting that change. And what essentially then is left on us is to just keep reinforcing whatever the changes that we see. So there's not a lot that you would need to do when the norm is already getting relaxed. One thing with one example that's coming to my mind is specifically around education, specifically school education. That particular norm we feel in the last 8-10 years has relaxed a bit, and specifically across all stakeholders. The second one is around misperception, wherein the norms are relaxing, but at the same time, various groups don't see it happening. So because a lot of changes that happen are fairly subtle in nature, they're not very easily observable. So you see a lot of things happening, but you're not able to pinpoint that this is exactly what has changed. And what essentially results in is that you're not able to articulate in language that this particular change has actually happened. And what essentially then you do from a norms change strategy is to highlight those kind of changes, underscore those changes, and particularly use cases of social proof or any kind of outliers, highlight those outliers who are actually doing that. One thing that comes to my mind specifically is around the kind of initiatives that girls and women take. You see a lot of improvement when it comes to girls' performance, academic performance is concerned, the kind of leadership roles that they've started taking up. But then when you see them, you always see them in isolated cases. You not usually what we see is that people do not look at or create a certain kind of a narrative shift based on these changes, and hence you see specific changes, but what we miss is a larger norms change. And hence there is a need for us to articulate it very clearly that these are the kind of changes that we're actually seeing on the ground, and also highlight the outliers or the people who are actually bringing about those changes. The third one is where you see that there is some kind of there's some kind of disagreement with the norm. So people are starting rejecting that negative norm, but at the same time they lack the confidence to accept that in public. And that is basically a classic case where you it's a classic case of pluralistic ignorance, wherein you feel that you're in line with what has to be done, but you lack the courage to accept that in public. One thing which comes to my mind specifically is with respect to men's participation in household chores. In private, men would accept that and would actually support and take up a lot of household chores. But the moment you meet them in a group setting, particularly when there are other men, they would lack the courage to accept that. And that is where what we miss out on is that you see behavior change shifts, but you do not see any normative shift, because there is you're still bound by the expectations that the other men have set. So broadly, in order to change that, what you would look at is having some kind of a collective discussion, bringing people together. And essentially, at the root is a certain kind of miscommunication or a lack of a proper communication channel between menfolk and the ones who have actually have undergone the change. So the idea is to bring them all together and have an open conversation. And particularly if there is any kind of miscommunication, how do you get them to talk about and clear it? And the last one is where a particular norm is extremely sticky and where the norms are extremely hard to shift. And you also know that not any tangible shift might be possible in the next 2 or 3 years, particularly because of the kind of backlash you would anticipate. And hence, the only strategy that is left in that case is to avoid any kind of narrative change kind of communication in that case, and focus specifically around micro behaviors that you feel are relatively safer. And you feel that to the extent possible, you could actually avoid any kind of backlash from the community. So broadly, the idea is to kind of play safe and also identify that the next 2-3 years you'd focus only on certain micro behaviors and not talk about the larger narrative shift at this moment.